2 centuries ago, your entire future could be decided before you turned 7. Education in the 1800s was a world away from our modern classrooms, a system built not on equality, but on rigid social class, deep religious faith, and the demands of a newly industrial world. We are going to uncover the mysterious and often surprising lessons given to children, from the sons of wealthy elites to the daughters of factory workers. By the end, you will know exactly what it was like to learn in an era of slate boards, strict morals, and stark inequality. We will reveal the peculiar textbooks that taught more than just reading and the classroom punishments that would be unthinkable today. What single subject do you believe was considered the most important for a child's soul? A child's classroom was often a reflection of their father's wallet. For the sons of wealthy merchants and landowners, education began in a comfortable home library with a private tutor. Their lessons stretched for hours, covering Latin, Greek, classical literature, and complex mathematics. This was not merely about knowledge, it was a deliberate cultivation of a future gentleman, a leader destined to inherit his family's position. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, the son of a factory worker might be lucky to spend a few hours in a crowded, single-room schoolhouse, if he was not already working 12-hour days inside a mill. His sister might receive no formal lessons at all, expected instead to master domestic chores from a very young age. The single most important subject in the 1800s was not found in any textbook. It was the unspoken lesson of social class itself, a curriculum of destiny written before a child could even read. This fundamental divide created 2 entirely separate worlds of learning. One path was paved with the goal of university and influence, while the other was a narrow trail focused on basic obedience and practical skills for a life of labor. How could 2 children born in the same year in the same city receive such profoundly different instructions for life? The answer lies in the very books they were given, and more tellingly, in the books they were denied. For the vast majority of children, the classroom was a single smoky room heated by a wood stove. This was the iconic one-room schoolhouse, a humble building of rough-hewn logs or simple clapboard, often perched at a crossroads or on a barren stretch of farmland. Inside, you would find students ranging in age from 5 to 15, all learning their lessons under the guidance of one teacher. The air was thick with the scent of pine wood smoke and the sound of murmured recitations, a low chorus of different grades all happening at once. With only a handful of tattered textbooks to share, students did most of their work on personal slate boards, scratching out sums and spelling words with soft slate pencils before wiping them clean for the next task. The teacher's greatest challenge was not just instruction, but sheer management, juggling the needs of beginners with the more advanced studies of the older pupils, all while trying to maintain a semblance of order. Discipline was a constant concern in such a mixed environment, and a teacher's authority had to be absolute, often enforced with a firm hand or a sharp ruler. Beyond its educational role, the schoolhouse was the heart of the community. It hosted holiday pageants, town meetings, and Sunday services. In an otherwise isolated rural life, it was a vital gathering place where neighbors connected and children forged friendships across age groups. This simple structure, for all its limitations, was a powerful engine of basic literacy and civic life for generations. But the lessons on those slate boards went far beyond simple arithmetic and grammar. They were infused with a powerful moral code, one designed to shape character as much as intellect. Before a child ever held a modern book, their first teacher was often a small wooden paddle. This was the hornbook, a deceptively simple learning tool. It was not a book at all, but a single sheet of paper nailed to a piece of wood and covered by a thin, transparent sheet of animal horn. This protective layer gave the device its name and made it incredibly durable for small, careless hands. On that paper was the child's entire introduction to literacy, the alphabet, followed by a list of simple syllables and almost always the Lord's Prayer. A child would trace these letters with a finger, repeating the sounds over and over until they were memorized. The hornbook was a personal, tangible object, a constant companion in those earliest lessons. But its purpose went deeper than just learning letters. It was a child's first deliberate step into a world governed by faith and moral rules. Once a student graduated from the Hornbook, they were handed a text that would define early American education for generations, the New England Primer. This small book was a revolution in its own right, the first real textbook for the masses. It began, logically, with the alphabet, but each letter was paired with a religious rhyme designed to be memorized. For the letter A, a child did not learn about an apple. Instead, they recited "In Adam's fall we sinned all." The letter B was followed by "Thy life to mend, this book attend." The entire primer was saturated with this kind of direct moral and religious instruction. Learning to read was inseparable from learning the tenets of faith and the consequences of sin. These were not just reading lessons, they were daily drills in doctrine. The very act of spelling became a repetitive reinforcement of a specific worldview. Can you recall a simple rhyme from your own childhood? Now consider the weight of these verses, which taught children their first letters while simultaneously reminding them of humanity's inherent sinfulness. This was education with a dual purpose, literacy and salvation woven tightly together. The primer's contents left no room for ambiguity about what society valued most in a child: a pious heart and an obedient spirit. While the New England Primer taught children their letters through Scripture, a new series of books would soon capture the nation's heart and mind. The McGuffey Eclectic Readers sold over 120 million copies, a staggering number that made them the most influential textbooks in 19th century America. Unlike the single, dense primer, McGuffey created a graduated system. A young child started with the first reader, filled with simple, moralistic tales in large print. As they advanced, the stories grew more complex, leading older students through the sixth reader, a volume containing sophisticated essays, speeches, and literary excerpts from authors like Shakespeare and John Milton. The true genius of these books, however, was not in their academic structure but in their unwavering mission. The primary goal was not merely literacy, but character building. A typical story in a mid-level reader might tell the tale of a poor but honest boy who finds a wallet full of money and returns it to its wealthy owner. The story would painstakingly detail the boy's internal struggle against temptation, his ultimate choice to be honest, and the rich reward, not of money, but of the owner's respect and a potential offer of employment. Every narrative was engineered to promote specific virtues: hard work, honesty, thrift, patriotism, and piety. A story about a young girl might focus on her cheerful diligence in completing her chores, while a piece on George Washington would emphasize his unwavering integrity. These were not subtle suggestions, they were clear, repeatable lessons on how to be a good American. For generations, this shared literary experience created a common cultural and ethical framework. A farmer's son in Ohio and a merchant's daughter in New York were often reading the exact same stories, absorbing the same values, and learning the same definition of a virtuous life. This was a powerful, unifying force in a young and expanding nation, building a collective conscience one classroom at a time. The words children recited from their McGuffey readers were only one part of their daily instruction. The true foundation of their schooling was built upon three core subjects, a simple but demanding trio known as the 3 R's. Reading, writing, and arithmetic formed the essential toolkit for any child deemed worthy of an education. Learning to read was a methodical and often monotonous process. There was no guessing at words from pictures. Instead, children learned through rigorous phonics and rote memorization. The classroom would echo with the collective drone of young voices chanting letter sounds, then syllables, and finally whole words, repeated until they were etched permanently into memory. This was not about fostering a love of literature. It was about mastering a fundamental skill through sheer, disciplined repetition. Once a child could decipher words, the next challenge was to create them. Writing was a physical and messy art. Students did not have ballpoint pens. They used dip pens, carefully crafted with a steel nib that had to be dipped frequently into a small, open glass inkwell set into their desk. A single careless move could result in a large ink blot spoiling an hour's work. Penmanship was a subject in itself, with drills focused on forming perfect, uniform cursive letters. Popular methods like the Palmer method emphasized rhythmic, whole arm movements to build muscle memory for elegant, standardized handwriting. A person's script was seen as a direct reflection of their character and discipline, so these drills were practiced for hours. The final pillar was arithmetic, always called Rithmetic in the 3 R's. This was not abstract math for its own sake. It was intensely practical, designed for the lives children were expected to lead. Mental arithmetic was prized, with students learning to calculate sums and differences in their heads with speed and accuracy. They worked with fractions to understand measurements for recipes or building materials. They learned basic bookkeeping to manage a farm's accounts or a small shop's ledger. Tools like the wooden abacus helped visualize calculations, but most work was done on those ever-present slate boards, where a wrong answer could be quickly wiped away and corrected. This was math for survival, for commerce, and for managing a household. The 3 R's, in their straightforward way, equipped a child with the basic instruments to navigate a world of ledgers, deeds, and letters. A world where clear communication and accurate numbers could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. But these skills were taught within a framework of absolute discipline, where a single ink blot or a wrong sum was more than a simple mistake. A perfect line of cursive handwriting was far more than just a skill. It was a visible mark of good breeding and a disciplined mind. Students spent countless hours in penmanship drills, their arms moving in precise, rhythmic patterns to shape each loop and curve. The goal was a uniform, elegant script that flowed effortlessly across the page, a silent testament to the writer's character. A blot of ink or a shaky letter was not merely a mistake in spelling, it was a moral failing, a sign of a careless or impure spirit. This tedious practice was a daily ritual, forging patience and attention to detail into every child who mastered it. But the art of eloquence was not confined to the page. The classroom walls often rang with the voices of children reciting from memory. Oratory was a pillar of education, a direct preparation for a public life of influence and debate. Students were tasked with memorizing and performing long passages from famous speeches, epic poems, and the Bible. They would stand before their classmates, backs straight and voices clear, delivering the words of Patrick Henry or the verses of Longfellow. This was not just an exercise in rote learning. It was a deliberate training in poise, in commanding attention, and in conveying complex ideas with conviction and grace. For a young man, the ability to speak well in a town meeting or a court of law could define his entire future. For a young woman, it was a sign of refinement and cultured upbringing. In a world before electronic media, the power of the spoken word was paramount, and the classroom was the training ground for the next generation of community leaders and virtuous citizens. The pressure to perform flawlessly in both writing and speech was immense, creating an environment where every pen stroke and every spoken word was a measure of your worth. The precise curves of a well-formed letter and the measured tones of a memorized speech were always directed toward a higher purpose. In the 1800s, the ultimate goal of education was not merely to create a literate citizen, but a saved soul. Religion was not a separate subject, it was the very air the classroom breathed, and the Bible was its most important textbook. This single volume served multiple practical roles, its pages used to teach reading, its stories providing lessons in history and morality, and its psalms offering the first practice in elocution. A child learning to read might sound out words from the book of Genesis long before they ever saw a children's storybook. History lessons were drawn from the chronicles of kings and prophets, while moral instruction came directly from the parables and commandments. The school day itself was structured around faith. It commonly began with a prayer led by the teacher, a solemn request for divine guidance and an obedient spirit. This was often followed by the singing of hymns, their simple melodies and profound lyrics reinforcing the day's spiritual themes. For many children, this daily practice was their only formal musical instruction. The most demanding religious exercise, however, was the memorization of catechisms. These were long, question and answer formats that outline the core doctrines of the church. A teacher would pose a question like, "What is the chief end of man?" and the student was expected to recite the exact, memorized response, to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. There was no room for personal interpretation or opinion, only perfect, verbatim recall. This was not seen as oppressive, but as essential. In a world where childhood diseases were often fatal, the line between education and salvation was dangerously thin. Parents and teachers alike believed that reading the Bible was the most critical skill a child could learn, because it held the keys to eternal life. A child who could read Scripture could access God's grace directly. This created a powerful fusion of intellectual and spiritual development, where learning your letters was the first step on a path toward righteousness, and a spelling error was a trivial concern compared to a moral failing. The classroom was a training ground for both this world and the next, a place where the 3 R's served a fourth and far greater purpose: redemption. That same moral certainty extended to the very maps that hung on the classroom wall. While children learned their spiritual place from the Bible, they learned their physical place in the world from the subject of geography. A massive pull-down map, often faded and frayed at the edges, would dominate the space above the blackboard. Lessons were not about cultural understanding or exploration. They were exercises in pure, disciplined memorization. A teacher would point a long wooden stick at the map, and the students would chant in unison: the capitals of Europe, the longest rivers of Asia, the highest mountain peaks in South America. This was a litany of facts to be absorbed and recalled without error. There was no discussion of why a city became a capital or how a river shaped the lives of the people living near it. The goal was to build a mental atlas of the world, defined by borders, landmarks, and names. For a nation still expanding its own frontiers, this knowledge felt practical and powerful. It gave children a sense of a vast, cataloged world, one that could be mastered through diligent effort and a good memory. But this geographic knowledge was paired with a very specific version of the past. History lessons were not a neutral record of events. They were a curated collection of heroic stories, designed not to analyze but to inspire unwavering patriotism. The narrative was simple and clear, a triumphant march of progress led by flawless national founders. A child would learn about George Washington's honesty, the bravery of the Minutemen at Lexington, and the wisdom of the Founding Fathers in Philadelphia. Textbooks presented these men not as complex figures with personal ambitions and flaws, but as near mythical archetypes of virtue and courage. Complex events like the American Revolution were stripped of their political and economic complications, becoming a straightforward moral drama of liberty against tyranny. This was history as a civic religion, and its primary purpose was to forge a strong, unified national identity in the young. Students were never asked to consider the perspective of a loyalist farmer who opposed independence, or to question the impact of expansion on Native American tribes. The past was a tool for building pride and loyalty in the present. Can you recall a story from your own childhood that you later discovered was far more complicated than you were first told? For the 19th century student, that moment of revelation was unlikely to ever come inside the classroom. Their understanding of the world and its history was a clean, orderly map, with all the messy, difficult parts carefully left off the page. This carefully constructed worldview, however, was about to be challenged by a new force that would reshape childhood itself. Yet even maps and history books could not contain a child's curiosity about the living world. While they called it natural philosophy, the study of science was a hands-on affair, grounded in the soil and stars that surrounded them. Textbooks provided the framework, but true learning happened through direct observation. Students learned to classify the natural world, carefully pressing wildflowers into notebooks and labeling them with their proper Latin names. They sketched the intricate veins of a leaf and noted the migration patterns of local birds. Basic astronomy was not just a chapter in a book. It was a nightly practice of locating the North Star and tracing the constellations that guided the seasons. Simple physics was demonstrated with pulleys and levers. showing the practical mechanics that could lift a heavy bucket from a well. The most effective tool for this was the object lesson. A teacher would bring a piece of granite, a bird's nest, or a single apple into the classroom. Students would pass it around, feeling its weight and texture, describing its color and form, and deducing its origin and purpose. This was science through the senses, a method that transformed abstract concepts into tangible truths held in their own hands. For the vast majority of children living on farms, this entire approach was not academic, it was essential. Their lessons in agricultural science were a matter of survival. They learned how to test the soil's acidity, how to rotate crops to preserve nutrients, and which plants could be used to treat a sick animal. A lesson on botany was directly applied to understanding which weeds would choke a cornfield, and a lesson on entomology helped identify the pests that could destroy a harvest. In this world, a child's education was not separate from their life. It was a vital tool for tending to it. The classroom extended far beyond its four walls, into the fields and forests where every leaf and insect offered a lesson waiting to be uncovered. Before a child ever saw the inside of a formal schoolhouse, their education often began in a neighbor's cozy kitchen. This was the dame school, an unassuming but vital institution run by a local woman, often a widow or a wife looking to supplement her family's income. Her home became the classroom, with the warm smell of baking bread mixing with the scent of slate pencils and worn paper. The students were the very youngest children, barely past toddler age, gathered around her kitchen table for their first lessons in literacy and life. The curriculum was simple and practical. Children learned to recognize their letters from a shared hornbook and to count using buttons or beans scattered across the table. They practiced their numbers by scratching on small personal slates, their lessons punctuated by the familiar sounds of domestic life. For the little girls in attendance, the education was distinctly gendered. While the boys practiced their sums, the girls were often taught to sew. They learned basic stitches on samplers of rough cloth, carefully embroidering the alphabet as a way to combine needlework with literacy. A single sampler might display a perfectly stitched row of letters alongside a simple moral verse, a testament to the dual goals of skillful hands and a pious mind. The dame school served a crucial dual purpose. For parents, it was a trusted form of childcare, allowing them to work knowing their young children were safe and supervised. For the children, especially girls, it was frequently the only formal instruction they would ever receive. Many girls were pulled from this gentle introduction to learning by the age of 7 or 8, their education deemed complete so they could focus entirely on household duties at home. The dame school was a quiet, foundational layer of early learning, a world where the lines between a home and a classroom, between childcare and instruction, were beautifully and purposefully blurred. It was here, in these humble settings, that countless children took their very first steps into the world of written words, a world whose gates were firmly guarded by the expectations of their station and their gender. That sampler, carefully stitched under the watchful eye of a dame school teacher, was more than a child's craft. It was a perfect symbol of the entire educational path laid out for girls. While their brothers might move on to advanced arithmetic and classical languages, a girl's schooling was deliberately funneled toward a single, overarching goal: to become a marriageable and capable manager of a household. Her academic lessons were often cut short, deemed unnecessary for her future duties. The core skills of reading and writing were taught not for intellectual exploration, but for a purely practical purpose, so she could read her Bible, manage the household accounts, and write letters to her family. Anything beyond that was frequently viewed as a frivolous distraction from her true calling. The true curriculum for a young woman was not found in heavy textbooks, but in the graceful arts of domesticity and refinement, a collection of subjects known as accomplishments. A girl from a family with any social standing would spend hours each day practicing delicate needlework, transforming plain fabric into ornate displays of flowers and biblical verses. She learned to draw, not to become an artist, but to create pleasing sketches and paint delicate watercolors for the family's parlor. Musical training was essential, with lessons on the piano or harp considered a pinnacle of feminine cultivation. The ability to perform a simple tune for guests after dinner was a direct reflection on her family's status and her own disciplined character. Why invest in a girl's mind when her future was destined for the private sphere? The prevailing philosophy was clear and rarely questioned. A woman's highest purpose was to be a virtuous wife, a nurturing mother, and the moral guardian of the home. Her education was meticulously designed to equip her for this role and for no other. She was being prepared to create a tranquil, orderly, and morally sound sanctuary for her husband and children. Every stitch of embroidery, every perfectly played scale, was a step toward building that sanctuary and securing a suitable marriage proposal. Her value was measured not by her knowledge of geography or history, but by the elegance of her handwriting, the beauty of her needlepoint, and the sweetness of her singing voice. This was an education in being, not in doing, a careful cultivation of traits designed to attract a husband and uphold the social order. For a girl with a curious mind or a thirst for deeper learning, the classroom door was firmly closed long before she ever reached it. That gentle world of dame schools and cozy kitchens could not withstand the tidal wave of children flooding into industrial cities. A new, radical solution was needed, one that could teach hundreds of students for the price of a single teacher. The answer was the Lancasterian system, an educational model so ruthlessly efficient it mirrored the factories its students would one day work in. Imagine a single, cavernous hall filled with row upon row of benches, packed with not dozens, but hundreds of children. At the center stood one teacher, a master of ceremonies in this theater of learning. His real pupils, however, were not the masses before him, but a select group of older boys known as monitors. These were the system's foremen. Each monitor was a specialist, drilled to perfection in one tiny slice of knowledge. One monitor was an expert in the letter A, another in the number 5. When a class was called, groups of 10 or 12 younger students would march to their assigned station, where the monitor would drill them relentlessly on that single narrow fact. The entire school day was a synchronized dance of moving groups and chanted recitations, all governed by a complex system of signals, from hand bells to wooden tokens. This was education broken down into its smallest, most repeatable parts, an assembly line for the 3 R's. The system ran on a strict economy of rewards and punishments. For perfect recitation, a student might receive a paper ticket, a tangible token of merit that could be collected and traded for a small prize. But for mistakes or misbehavior, the consequences were immediate and public. A common punishment for a lazy student was to be tied to a bench or made to wear a heavy wooden sign around the neck proclaiming their fault, like idle or truant. In some schools, a child who fought might even have their legs shackled together. These were not acts of pure cruelty, but calculated methods of maintaining absolute order in a space that teetered on the brink of chaos. The Lancasterian system was a revolutionary, if deeply impersonal, answer to a desperate problem. It provided basic literacy and discipline to the children of the urban poor on an unprecedented scale, building a compliant workforce for a new industrial age. But what happened when a child failed to learn their lesson, or worse, challenged the teacher's authority? The answer lies in the object that hung in plain sight in every classroom, a tool of terror and control. The object that inspired true fear in a Lancasterian classroom was not a shackle or a sign, but a simple leather strap. This was the tawse, a cruel and clever instrument often split into 2 or 3 tails at the end, designed to maximize the sting on a child's open palm. Its threat was a constant presence, a physical reminder that the teacher's authority was absolute and backed by immediate, painful consequences. But for the children who spent their weekdays within the factory's deafening roar, there was a different kind of classroom, one that offered not the sting of the tawse, but the solace of Scripture. The Sunday school movement began as a radical act of charity, a direct response to the swarms of illiterate, impoverished children pouring into industrial cities. These children labored 6 days a week, their small bodies bent over looms or their lungs filled with coal dust deep in the mines. Sunday was their single day of rest, and the church saw an opportunity. It was not enough to save their souls. They had to teach them to read the Word of God for themselves. The Sunday school became a sanctuary of literacy for the working class. Here, in a simple church hall or a donated room, volunteers gathered these sooty, exhausted children for a few precious hours of instruction. The curriculum was straightforward and singular. The Bible itself was the textbook, the workbook, and the source of all moral lessons. A child learning their letters would painstakingly sound out the opening verse of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. A student practicing penmanship would carefully copy a line from the Psalms. Their first complete sentences, read aloud in halting voices, were the parables of Jesus. This was a brilliant and efficient fusion of purpose. The Bible was a text every community member respected, making its use in education beyond reproach. It provided an endless supply of material for reading practice, from simple nouns like lamb and shepherd to complex philosophical ideas. For the first time, many of these children were not just hearing the scriptures preached from a pulpit. They were unlocking them with their own minds, letter by letter. This empowerment was profound. A factory boy who could read his Bible could now engage with his faith directly, without a priest or an overseer as an intermediary. He could find comfort in its promises and guidance in its laws. The Sunday school did more than just teach reading. It gave a generation of poor children the key to their own spiritual and intellectual liberation, all while reinforcing the unbreakable bond between piety and learning. In a world that valued them only for their labor, it affirmed that they, too, possessed a soul worth educating. The leather tawse was merely one instrument in a vast and unforgiving orchestra of punishment. A teacher's desk drawer often held an entire arsenal of corrective tools, each with its own specific purpose and particular sting. The most common was the rat and cane, a slender, flexible rod that whistled through the air before landing with a sharp crack on a student's outstretched hand or bare legs. A simple wooden ruler served a dual purpose, for measuring lines on paper and for rapping the knuckles of a child who gave a wrong answer or talked out of turn. In some regions, a whip made of birch twigs was used, its multiple strands ensuring the punishment was felt widely and memorably. The offenses that triggered these responses seem trivial today: a whispered word to a classmate, a failure to memorize a Bible verse, a blot of ink on a copybook, or simply being perceived as lazy. The underlying philosophy was absolute and rarely questioned, drawn directly from a common interpretation of Scripture: spare the rod and spoil the child. This was not seen as cruelty, but as a moral duty. Adults believed that a child's will was inherently sinful and needed to be broken, much like a young horse needed breaking, to instill the obedience and self-discipline required for a righteous life. Fear was the engine of the classroom, the primary tool for maintaining order among 60 or even 80 students. But physical pain was only one method of control. For lesser infractions, a teacher would turn to psychological humiliation. A child who struggled with their lessons might be forced to sit on a high stool in the corner, wearing a conical dunce cap that labeled them as the class fool. They would sit there, a visible spectacle of failure, until the teacher decided their shame had been sufficient. Others might be made to stand for hours on one foot, face the wall, or wear a sign around their neck detailing their laziness or dishonesty. The goal was the same, whether through physical pain or public shame: to enforce conformity and crush any spark of defiance. The classroom was a microcosm of a world that valued obedience above creativity, and where a child's spirit was often the collateral damage in the relentless pursuit of order. A student's slate board was a temporary canvas, wiped clean after every lesson, but the specialized textbooks that began appearing on classroom shelves were meant to last a lifetime. As the 19th century progressed, education moved beyond the all-in-one primer toward distinct subjects, each with its own dedicated volume. A grammar book was no longer just a few pages in the back of a reader. It was a dense manual of rules, drilling students in the intricate laws of parsing sentences and identifying every part of speech. Geography textbooks unfolded the world in detailed chapters, filled with maps and exhaustive lists of capitals, populations, and exports. Science, once a simple collection of object lessons, found its place in formal natural philosophy texts that explain the principles of levers, the water cycle, and the classification of the animal kingdom. These books transformed the teacher from the sole source of knowledge into a guide through a pre-written world of facts. To make those facts come alive, classrooms began to fill with a new array of teaching aids. A large, polished globe became the centerpiece of many a lesson, its spherical form a tangible truth that no flat map could provide. Students could trace the routes of great explorers with a finger, spinning the world to follow the path of Magellan or Columbus. Wall charts, often large and brightly colored, turned abstract concepts into vivid spectacles. One might display the detailed anatomy of a honeybee, its legs and wings labeled with precise script. Another could show the layered rock formations of the Grand Canyon, a visual geology lesson for the entire class to see. But the most magical device arrived later in the century, the magic lantern projector. This precursor to the slide projector used a bright lamp and a series of hand-painted glass slides to cast images onto a white wall or a suspended sheet. With a turn of a lever, a teacher could transport students from their dusty classroom to the pyramids of Egypt, the icy plains of the Arctic, or the surface of the moon. The slow, mesmerizing cycle of the planets or the dramatic eruption of a volcano could be displayed in a darkened room, holding every child in silent, wide-eyed wonder. These tools were not just for entertainment. They were the first steps toward a visual education, an admission that some truths about the world were simply too vast or too complex to be contained by words on a slate. The polished globe and magic lantern projected a world of knowledge, but for millions of children, their classroom was a spinning loom. The Industrial Revolution created a brutal conflict between the ideal of education and the grim necessity of child labor. A factory owner needed small, nimble fingers to clean under active machinery or tie broken threads on clattering textile frames. A family struggling on the edge of starvation needed the few coins a child could bring home. For these children, the schoolhouse was not a sanctuary of learning. It was a distant dream they passed on their pre-dawn trudge to the mills. Their education was not reading and writing, but the monotonous, dangerous rhythms of industrial work. A typical workday began before sunrise and ended long after sunset, lasting 12, 14, or even 16 hours. The air they breathed was thick with cotton dust or coal soot, damaging their young lungs for life. The constant din of machinery caused permanent hearing loss, and a single moment of fatigue could lead to a catastrophic accident, costing a child a finger, a hand, or worse. Exhaustion was their constant companion. After such a day, what energy remained for spelling or sums? There was no time for homework, no mental space for reciting poetry. The factory consumed every ounce of their strength, leaving them as empty vessels at the end of each day. The fight to get these children out of the factories and into schools became one of the great social battles of the era. Reformers argued that a nation's future depended not on the cheap labor of its children, but on their educated minds. They published shocking reports detailing the deformities, illiteracy, and stunted lives of the factory class. The push for child labor laws and the campaign for compulsory education were two fronts in the very same war. One sought to protect a child's body from exploitation, while the other fought for their mind's right to grow. Every law that raised the minimum working age was a victory for the empty school desk. Every hour shaved off the work week was an hour that could be spent with a book. This was not just about kindness, it was a fundamental reimagining of childhood itself, from a source of labor to a period of preparation. The classroom and the factory floor were locked in a direct competition for the soul of a generation, a struggle that would determine what kind of future these children were actually being prepared for. While the factory child learned the rhythm of the loom, the son of a wealthy merchant was mastering the language of Cicero. His classroom was a world away from the crowded schoolhouse, housed instead in the stately brick buildings of a private academy or an exclusive boarding school. Here, the goal was not basic literacy, but the cultivation of a mind fit to lead. The curriculum was a demanding and deliberately archaic gateway to power, built upon the twin pillars of advanced Latin and classical Greek. Students did not merely learn to translate these dead languages. They were expected to think and argue in them, analyzing the philosophical texts of Plato and the epic poetry of Homer in their original forms. This was paired with the study of rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, where young men practiced crafting complex arguments and delivering them with calculated eloquence. Their days were filled with higher mathematics, not for practical accounting, but to train the mind in pure, abstract logic and with moral philosophy, which taught them the ethical frameworks expected of a gentleman. Every subject, from ancient history to advanced sciences, was filtered through this classical lens. The purpose was explicit: to create a shared intellectual and cultural identity among the ruling class. A boy from Boston and a boy from Charleston, both educated in this tradition, could meet at Harvard or Yale and immediately recognize each other as peers, speaking the same academic language and revering the same ancient models of statesmanship. This education was a powerful social barrier, its very difficulty proving that those who mastered it were inherently suited to govern. It was a long and expensive investment in a single future, one that guaranteed his place in the pulpit, the courtroom, or the halls of government, forever separate from the masses whose education ended with the third reader. A single man's conviction began to dismantle the factory gates. Horace Mann, a Massachusetts lawyer turned educational reformer, looked at a nation of one-room schoolhouses and child laborers and saw a crisis for democracy itself. He championed a revolutionary idea, the common school. These would be free, state-funded institutions open to all children, rich and poor alike, creating a shared experience for the next generation of citizens. Mann argued that a republic could not survive if its voters were ignorant and easily manipulated. Universal education, he insisted, was the great equalizer, the only force capable of balancing the destabilizing pressures of social class and wealth. His vision was not merely about literacy. It was about building a common national character, instilling the values of punctuality, order, and civic duty in every child. This idea was fiercely resisted. Taxpayers balked at funding the education of other people's children. Factory owners lobbied against it, fearing the loss of their cheap, disposable workforce. Many parents, reliant on their children's meager wages, saw compulsory schooling as an oppressive intrusion into family affairs. Yet the movement gained momentum, fueled by a growing belief that childhood should be a time of learning, not just labor. Massachusetts passed the first compulsory education law in 1852, requiring children to attend school for at least 12 weeks a year. Other states followed, but slowly and with great variation. The laws were often weak, enforcement was spotty, and exemptions for agricultural work were common. But the principle was now etched into law. The state had a legitimate interest in the mind of the child. This was a profound shift in the relationship between government and family. For the first time, the right and the responsibility to educate the young was moving from the private hearth to the public sphere. Every new law was a direct challenge to the economic engine of child labor, declaring that a child's place was in a classroom, not a mine. It was the beginning of a long, hard-fought battle to redefine the very purpose of a childhood, transforming it from a private asset into a public trust. While the common school movement fought for a child's right to a desk, a quieter revolution was brewing that redefined what should happen at that desk. It was called kindergarten, a German word meaning children's garden, and its founder, Friedrich Froebel, envisioned early learning not as a factory for facts, but as a nurturing ecosystem for the whole child. This was a radical departure from the rigid, silent classrooms of the era. Froebel believed that young children learn most naturally not through rote memorization and recitation, but through guided play, creative expression, and social interaction. His kindergarten classroom was a vibrant space filled with song, communal games, and structured activities designed to awaken a child's mind and spirit in unison. The heart of his method was a series of precisely sequenced play materials he called gifts. The first gift was a simple set of 6 soft, colored woolen balls. A child would hold, roll, and toss these balls, learning about color, movement, and unity through their hands, Subsequent gifts included a wooden sphere, a cube, and a cylinder, teaching the fundamental relationships between shapes. Then came the most famous gifts of all, sets of wooden blocks. Children used these not just to build towers, but to create intricate patterns and structures, unconsciously grasping the principles of geometry, symmetry, and balance. Every activity, from folding colored paper to weaving mats, was a lesson in disguise. This was not idle play, it was the work of childhood, a deliberate process of discovering the hidden order of the universe through tangible objects. The kindergarten philosophy began to shift the very goal of early education. It was no longer about forcing a predetermined set of knowledge into a child's mind, but about cultivating their innate curiosity and social abilities, allowing their understanding to blossom from within like a well-tended plant. This German import slowly took root in American cities in the latter part of the century, often meeting with skepticism from those who saw play as the enemy of discipline. Yet it planted a seed, a revolutionary idea that would eventually grow to challenge the very foundations of what a classroom should be. For the vast majority of boys, a classroom education ended early to make way for a far more practical future. The real school was a blacksmith's forge, a printer's shop, or a carpenter's bench. At the age of 12 or 13, a boy's family would formally sign an indenture contract, legally binding him to a master craftsman for a term of 5, 7, or even 9 years. This document outlined a strict set of obligations for both parties, creating a relationship that was part employment, part education, and part foster care. The master pledged to teach the boy the mysteries of his trade, providing not just instruction but also food, lodging, clothing, and sometimes even basic reading lessons. In return, the apprentice vowed absolute obedience. He promised to work diligently to keep his master's secrets, to avoid taverns and gambling, and to remain celibate for the duration of his contract. His life was no longer his own. He lived under his master's roof, following the rhythms of the workshop from dawn until dusk. The learning was entirely hands-on, a slow accumulation of skill through constant repetition and correction. A young printer's apprentice would not start by setting type for a book. He would begin by mixing ink, sweeping floors, and running errands. Only after proving his reliability would he graduate to the tedious, precise work of placing individual metal letters into a composing stick, letter by backward letter. A blacksmith's boy would spend months working the massive bellows to keep the forge fire blazing before he was ever allowed to hold a hammer against hot iron. This was education built on muscle memory and patient observation, a daily immersion in the sights, sounds, and smells of a craft. The master was not a gentle teacher in the modern sense. His primary concern was the quality of the work leaving his shop, and his methods of correction could be as harsh as any schoolmaster's. A sloppy joint or a poorly set line of type would earn a sharp rebuke, or worse, a physical blow. The goal was to produce not just a skilled craftsman, but a disciplined and respectable member of the guild. Upon successful completion of his term, the apprentice would become a journeyman, free to travel and work for wages for any master. The ultimate prize, after years more of work and saving, was to become a master himself, to take on apprentices of his own and secure his place in the economic life of the community. This system was the primary engine of skilled labor for centuries, a world where a boy's future was forged not in books, but in the heat of the workshop. While the apprentice mastered his craft under a legal contract, an entire population of children were forbidden by law from even learning their letters. For an enslaved child in the antebellum South, the desire for knowledge was a dangerous and punishable crime. Following the Bloody Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831, Southern states enacted a wave of harsh new statutes known as anti-literacy laws. These laws made it a crime to teach an enslaved person, child or adult, to read or write. The punishment for a black person caught learning could be a savage public whipping. For a white person caught teaching, the penalty was often a heavy fine or even imprisonment. The justification was brutally clear. A literate enslaved person was a threat. They could read about abolitionist movements in the North. They could forge passes to aid their escape. and they could no longer be fully controlled by a system that relied on their ignorance. The power of the written word was so feared that it had to be outlawed, but the human spirit craves knowledge, and in the face of this terror, a secret educational network was born. Under the cover of darkness, in hidden cabins and secluded woods, courageous individuals risked everything. An enslaved person who had somehow learned a few letters might quietly gather children around a dying fire, using charcoal to scratch the alphabet onto a piece of scrap wood. A sympathetic white child might sneak an old primer to a black playmate, sharing lessons in whispered secrecy. Every letter learned was an act of defiance, a quiet rebellion against the chains of forced ignorance. Each word decoded was a step toward a future they dared to envision for themselves. In the North, the situation for free black children was legally different, but still profoundly unequal. While not outlawed, their education was systematically marginalized. They were forced into segregated schools that were chronically underfunded and often held in damp church basements or dilapidated buildings rejected by the white school system. The textbooks were cast-offs, the teachers were paid less, and the message was unmistakable: your education is a secondary concern. Yet here, too, the community fought back with immense courage and resolve. Free black families, many themselves scraping by on meager wages, pooled their resources to establish their own independent schools. Churches became centers of learning, with ministers and educated members of the congregation volunteering as teachers. These schools were more than just classrooms, they were fortresses of hope and self-determination. Parents worked extra hours to pay the small tuition, understanding that literacy was not just a skill, but the very key to claiming their full humanity and securing a better future for their children. In a world that told them they were inferior, the simple act of learning to read a newspaper or write one's own name became a profound declaration of personhood and an unshakable belief in liberation. Even the loudest schoolyard was once a place of quiet controversy. The ringing of a handbell for recess was not a guaranteed sound in the 1800s. For many educators and parents, the very idea of play was a scandalous waste of precious time. A child's unstructured minutes were seen as an open invitation to idleness, the root of all mischief and moral decay. Why would you let a child chase a friend around a field when they could be memorizing another Bible verse or practicing their penmanship? Every moment spent in play was a moment stolen from the serious business of building a disciplined mind and a pious soul. The schoolyard itself was a testament to this austerity. There were no bright plastic climbing structures or rubber kickballs. Play was built from the scraps of the adult world. A discarded barrel hoop and a simple stick became a thrilling race across the school grounds. A handful of clay marbles, carefully shaped and baked, represented a child's entire fortune. A length of old rope, salvaged and frayed, was the only equipment needed for a game of jump rope, its rhythm punctuated by traditional chants. The simplest game of all, tag, required nothing but a patch of open space and the breathless, laughing energy of youth. These games were not organized by adults. They were passed down from older children to younger ones, an oral and physical tradition of rules and rhymes that existed entirely outside the formal classroom. Yet these simple pleasures were constantly under threat. The pressure to produce useful, obedient citizens was so intense that many school boards argued for eliminating recess entirely, replacing those 15 minutes of freedom with extra drills in arithmetic or spelling. They believed a child's will was like a wild branch that needed to be constantly bent toward usefulness, and play was the one time it was allowed to spring back, unruly and untamed. But a new wind was beginning to blow through the world of education. Forward-thinking doctors and philosophers started to argue that a child was not just a small adult, but a developing being with unique physical and emotional needs. They observed that physical activity was not just about burning off energy, it was essential for building strong bodies and resilient minds. They began to see unstructured play not as idle frivolity, but as the vital work of childhood, a time for learning social rules, negotiating conflict, and exercising imagination in a way that no structured lesson could ever provide. The scraped knee from a fall during tag taught resilience. The complicated rules of a marble game taught fairness and strategy. The shared chant of a jump rope rhyme created a bond of community. The fight for recess was a quiet battle for the soul of childhood itself, a struggle to prove that some of life's most important lessons are not learned while sitting silently at a desk, but while running, laughing, and playing under an open sky. Behind the teacher's desk stood a figure of immense responsibility, yet one who was often little more than a child herself. The typical school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse was a teenage girl, perhaps only 16 or 17 years old, hired straight out of her own schooling. She was almost always unmarried, and her salary was a pittance, often half that of a male teacher in a similar role. Her own education may have extended only through the 8th grade, yet she was now expected to be the sole authority on every subject for 24 students ranging in age from 5 to 15. Her day began before sunrise, lighting the wood stove to warm the frigid classroom, and ended long after dusk, as she cleaned the building and prepared the next day's lessons by the dim light of a single oil lamp. Her greatest challenge was the sheer logistical puzzle of her classroom. With students at every level of learning, she had to be a master of juggling, conducting a reading lesson with the youngest children while the older ones worked on arithmetic problems, and then swiftly switching to hear a geography recitation from the middle group. All of this was accomplished with a severe lack of supplies. Perhaps one shared geography textbook for the entire school and a few precious pieces of chalk. Her authority was constantly tested by older, stronger boys who saw little point in being disciplined by someone so young. To maintain order, she had to project an image of unshakable sternness, her personal life held to an impossibly high standard. The community expected her to be a paragon of virtue. Her contract often explicitly forbade her from dating, from being seen in taverns, and even from wearing bright colors or cosmetics. Every aspect of her behavior, from her church attendance to the way she styled her hair, was scrutinized. For a female teacher, this professional path had a firm and final expiration date, the marriage bar. The moment she accepted a proposal, she was required to resign her position. The reasoning was that a woman's true vocation was as a wife and mother, and that she could not possibly manage the dual duties of a household and a classroom. This rule forced a heart-breaking choice between personal fulfillment and professional purpose, effectively ensuring that teaching remained a temporary job for young women, rather than a lifelong career. This dedicated, underpaid, and overworked young woman was the fragile engine of public education, tasked with building the nation's future with little more than a slate board and her own formidable will. The education of a child 2 centuries ago was a map of their entire life, drawn long before they could hold the pencil. From the smoky warmth of the one-room schoolhouse with its scripture-filled primers to the hallowed halls of elite academies echoing with Greek and Latin, every lesson was a brick in a vast, unequal social structure. Children did not simply learn to read and write, they learned their place. Their education was a deliberate curriculum in morality, obedience, and the unshakable hierarchy of their world. The working-class child mastered the 3 R's as tools for a life of labor, their minds shaped by the moral tales of McGuffey Readers. The wealthy boy was molded into a gentleman through classical rhetoric and philosophy, his education a key to power and influence. For girls, learning was a narrow path toward domestic accomplishment, while for enslaved children, literacy itself was a dangerous and forbidden act. The classroom was never just a place of academic instruction. It was a training ground for the soul and a factory for the social order, reinforcing a child's predetermined destiny with every recited verse and practice pen stroke. If we could bring a child from that era into a modern classroom, the sheer noise and color would be overwhelming. They would see children of all backgrounds learning together, using magical devices that hold entire libraries, and debating ideas rather than just memorizing them. But one thing would likely strike them as the most strange and wonderful of all: the freedom to question, to imagine, and to shape their own future. What do you think a child from the 1800s would find most surprising about a classroom today?